were very generous in agreeing to present this body of work for us. I'm not sure who's going to go first, but since Barb is wearing the microphone, I'm going to guess that Barb Clint is going to be our first speaker, followed by Jacob VanSickle. And Barb is the principal investigator of a CDC REACH grant, and REACH stands for Racial and Ethnic Approaches to Community Health. And that grant is focused on active transportation, much of which you'll hear about in this talk. She also serves as the director of the Clevelanders in Motion Health Equity Branch of the YMCA of Greater Cleveland. And she really does a lot of work between some of her prior work, city planning, and the intersection with public health, mostly around active living. Jacob serves as the executive director of Bike Cleveland, which is an organization which he's co-founded 5 years ago, about. And prior to working at Bike Cleveland, he served as a community organizer for Slavic Village neighborhood and focused on active living, among other issues. So the presentation today is titled Active Transportation as a Health Equity Strategy. And I think we're going to hear about a broad span of activities that have been going on through multiple collaboratives. So, Barb, please.
Okay. All righty, thank you, Sue. Jacob and I are really delighted to have this chance to speak with you today about active transportation as a health equity strategy, and we're going to be focusing on a Cleveland-specific approach, the Midway Protected Bike Boulevard concept and plan. Before we get started, I wanted to disclose that the local match dollars used for the formal Midway Protected Bike Boulevard planning study over the last year, which the City of Cleveland's Planning Department led, came from the REACH grant that we direct, and our salaries are also paid by the REACH grant to work on this stuff. Also, throughout our presentation, we're going to be drawing on this particular report a good deal. This was a joint publication of the Sierra Club and the League of American Bicyclists. Came out in 2013, called The New Majority, Pedaling Toward Equity. It was the first bike report to really look at what's going on broadly in terms of growth in bicycling by sector across the country. And I think you'll be interested to see where the real growth is happening in the biking. Okay, the learning objectives for today's presentations are, first, to introduce the concept of active transportation and how it can serve as a health equity strategy, to differentiate between the various types of bike facilities that are out there and learn a little something about who those types of facilities attract, to review bike facility preferences that were identified by African American, Asian, and Hispanic Latino survey respondents, and then finally to describe the Midway Protected Bike Boulevard Network concept and how it could help to advance health equity in the city of Cleveland. So what is active transportation and how can it serve health equity goals? According to a Center for Disease Control and Prevention Transportation Health Impact Assessment Toolkit, active transportation is any self-propelled, human-powered mode of transportation, such as biking or walking. And this presentation, because Jacob and I are completely biased, is focusing on the bike side of things. Yes. Okay, in terms of what is health equity, these are a variety of phrases lifted from Healthy People 2020. You're familiar with a number of them. It's trying to achieve the highest level of health for all people, a fair chance to lead a healthy life, eliminating avoidable health inequities. You know, you're all pretty well, steeped in what that's all about. So how does any of this relate to our fair city? This is a Cleveland that we like to show off to our out-of-town family and friends. We're a city that really has a lot of cool things going on, a lot to be proud of, a lot of changes in recent years. And this is a Cleveland we conveniently avoid. It's a Cleveland that is fraught with all kinds of difficulties. We're a city with a lot of challenges. For one thing, we're a city at about 40% of our peak population of 1948. We used to have a city of almost 1 million people. According to the 2015 American Community Survey, we're hovering below 400,000. About 35% of our population lives in poverty, including about 50% of our kids and 19% of our seniors. We're a racially and ethnically diverse city, about 50% black, 35% white, 10% Hispanic, and 2%-ish Asian and mixed race reported. So that really means about 65% of our population is at elevated risk for various bad health outcomes. And these are some data that the Center for, the Prevention Research Center has collected through its most recent Behavior Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. And this is a quote that Elaine and I have worked on a couple of grants together, and one of her summary statements was, for nearly every health outcome identified as critical to our public health, Cleveland adults and youth fare worse than the state and national populations. And I circled just a few local data, like in terms of the incidence of overweight and obesity. For our city in total, the rate was about 67%, but it's 70% among African Americans and 79% among Hispanic. In terms of proper nutrition, there's similar, disparities. Physical activity, across the city, the average was 61% were active at least once in the past month, but that rate was a little less for African Americans, 59%. It was considerably lower for Hispanic Latinos at 50 or almost 51%. So, and that shows up in the actual chronic disease outcomes. While diabetes for the city in total was about 11.7%, it was 18% among African Americans, and much higher hypertension rates. So that just suggests how our, yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, sure.
But one demographic that was absolutely left out of there, the diabetes demographic, the hypertension demographic, is older adults. What was that included in the data that you just are showing?
I didn't pick that up, but we did. I know your data sliced and diced it. We can get at that. That's readily available data from the last BRFS. So if you have an interest in that, it's readily available. Yeah. Another thing that impacts on this is mobility, and about 30% of Cleveland's households do not have access to a private automobile. And you can see the darker the red, the higher the concentration of such households. And these households are subject to the whims of public transportation funding, to service cuts as have been implemented within the last year, and a lot of things like that. And then sprawl, the manner in which I talked about the population loss in the city proper, but you could see where, for the most part, where the population went. These were maps developed by Cuyahoga County Planning, 1948 and 2002. And in those 2 years, the population still hovered around 1.4 million for the county. But you can see in 48, the lion's share of that population was in the city of Cleveland proper and the first ring suburbs, Lakewood, Euclid. But by 2002, virtually the entire county, except for our deep river corridors, was developed. And this map only gets worse because our population for the county has now dipped below 1.4 million. We had kind of hovered at that point for 60 years, but we're now closer to 1.3 million. So there was an actual net loss in the population of the county. So how can bicycling serve as a population-level physical activity intervention? At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jacob, who's going to review some national data on biking trends in our country.
So Barb referenced this report that was put out by our national advocacy partner, the League of American Bicyclists, and it explored a lot of realities that we at Bike Cleveland have noticed through a lot of our programming that we do in Cleveland neighborhoods, but that there has been a sharp increase of bicycling among African American, Asian, and Hispanic Latino individuals. In addition, new immigrants to the U.S. are 2 times more likely to bike over native-born Americans. I'll take a sidebar. I don't know if I told Barb I'd mention this. But we're actually engaged with Catholic Charities and doing a program for refugees, new refugees that come into the United States, to help them earn a bike and teach them skills. and they have a plethora of refugees that are interested in this program. So even locally, the statistic shows that, just through that program, there's more and more immigrants coming to the United States that want access to a bicycle, want access to a cheap form of transportation, partially because of some of the things that Barb had said. A lot of these people are placed in neighborhoods. For example, there was one individual that lived in Lakewood but worked out in Twinsburg. It take hours to take a bus, but can you pair a bus with a bike to be able to get from your home to your work? In addition, the money people have is a key indicator. One of the refugees we talked with from Catholic Charities talked about, their goal is really to get a car so they can get where they need to go. But if you're making, very low wages and you're utilizing a car to get from point A to point B, that's not money you're spending in your community. And it really impacts a lot of the immigrant populations, especially living and working in Northeast Ohio. As we know, and I'll always tell people this, biking is on the rise. But it's not on the rise of people that generally look just like me. It's also among people like Barb, women, and people of color. While it's on the rise, though, there's also a big disparity, and this hits on, who's actually getting injured or killed riding their bicycles. While white folks are more likely to ride a bike currently, there's growth in minority populations riding bikes, but the percentage of minorities' rates of getting killed while riding a bicycle is 30% higher for African Americans and 23% higher for Hispanic and Latinos. I think that speaks volumes to where and how we design our neighborhoods, where these people are living. And they're telling us it's not just that they're getting hurt or they're dying while riding their bicycles, but they're telling us they want safer places to ride bikes. 26% of people of color said they're concerned about their safety while riding their bicycles in traffic. So what kind of bike facilities work, and for whom are they really working? Portland, one of the bicycling capitals of the United States, came up with a great depictor of the types of cyclists. So there's the strong and fearless, people like Barb and I, who will ride anywhere, anytime. Not to say that we wouldn't like a stress-free place to ride our bicycles, especially for me with my son. There's the enthused and confident, which encompasses about 7% of cyclists. The interested and concerned, which is about 60%, and the no way, no how, which would be about 33%. And for really, who are we designing our streets? Currently in Cleveland, we've seen a large growth of bike lanes, and we've also seen a lot of share rows and signs that say share the road. But is this really serving people that want to ride their bicycles but don't feel comfortable mixing in traffic? I mentioned we have a lot of bike lanes, and this is great. It helps to calm the traffic in the neighborhoods, gives cyclists a dedicated space to ride. But again, you're still only serving about 7% of the population. We have a really great Metro Park system. We have a lot of really great trails coming into Cleveland to connect neighborhoods. And that type of facility will serve those interested but concerned. And one thing that you'll hear about shortly from Barb is separated bike paths are also a medium to serve that 60% of people that are interested but concerned.
This is a great example of a protected bike facility in Queens. Yeah, imagine mixing with that level of traffic without this facility.
So for those of you that are the interest and concern bucket, 60%, would something like that get you out riding a bike? And I think that's really what this Midway plan is about.
Yeah, yep. So this is the vision, the Midway, a system of linear parks, much like what you just had a chance to virtually ride on, that would connect neighborhoods to neighborhoods and neighborhoods to key regional assets, like employment centers, schools, parks, things like that. This was an ad hoc process that got started about in 2012, although parts of it go back even further than that. And these are the people that were involved, and I want to call out my awareness of the utter lack of diversity in this photograph. And that speaks volumes to why I think we're stuck as we're stuck in this country growing the movement, because we don't have enough people of color who have an interest in riding at the table doing the planning with us. And this is, you know, among people who know better. And this is still what our planning committee looked like initially.
People too.
Pardon me?
A lot of young people too.
Yeah, yeah. I was the mom. But, you know, despite lacking diversity, we did recognize that there's a real issue in terms of this fundamental, you know, design concept for the Midway. For whom are we, the question, for whom are we designing our cities? Really, we all shared the opinion that to a very high extent, the design metric is throughputs. How fast can we get traffic through a neighborhood? It's not about who lives in those neighborhoods. It's about the cars from the suburbs moving to where you work, moving out. So, you know, that was, you know, what we were concerned. When you're dealing with traffic engineers, you hear all this discussion about level of service. It's all a time metric. How fast can we move cars? And that's crazy, and it has very adverse impacts on neighborhoods and people living in those neighborhoods. This additionally very important consideration behind this is street networks represent one of the largest land uses in a city. You don't think about that. You think about residential zoning and commercial zoning and industrial. You don't talk about streets as zoning. But a good part of a city's total land area is devoted to streets. And it's controlled by people who have been trained to think in terms of moving things through, not placemaking, not any of that. Although their industry is improving, that's still, even among some young traffic engineers, that's still the thinking. And their work dictates the quality of our lives. If they don't get over that engineering kind of training, they can increase the danger, not decrease the danger for people who are trying to move around on foot or by bicycle. So when we were launching the Midway thinking, we looked to our past to define our future. And by that I mean we looked at our old streetcar rights of way. We used to have in Cleveland a very extensive streetcar network. It was over 250 miles in length. And you know, these were, as you could see, there's a concentration on the east side that very much tracks with the concentration of homes that don't have access to cars. Those were historically streetcar communities. They transitioned to bus communities. They've always been public transportation reliant communities. And we need to ensure that these communities are multimodal, because as our transit systems are under funding pressures and service cuts, these are the neighborhoods that get impacted. So when the streetcars were removed, two very different approaches were taken in the city versus in the suburbs, because the streetcar network extended into Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights. You know, in the suburbs on the left, what had been streetcar rights of way became center medians with trees, and it created a lovelier environment to walk and move around in, that's for sure. But it also had a couple of other advantages. It continued to constrain the width of the streets for the cars, so you didn't get this sprawl that you see on the right-hand picture. So by strictly doing that, keeping the lanes relatively narrow, you automatically contain your speeds. When you give motorists wider lanes, all the studies show people begin to behave as though they're on a highway. You know, so the suburbs addressed that, and it also gave pedestrians a landing zone. So if you are trying to get across what was 5 lanes of traffic, you have a comfortable place to stand if you're older and not moving as fast as you once did, or if you're a young child. I mean, it's just all around a better approach. I like the fact that this picture on the right does show a bicycle navigating, you know, that street. What works in their favor, though, is we have no traffic. I mean, that's the upside. We have all this pavement and no traffic. So you can move around. That's a corridor that I prefer to take because there's no cars. This map shows that. Part of our planning team initially had a traffic engineer on it, who was also a regular bicyclist, and a GIS student that was really proficient in GIS skills. So what they did was a quick analysis of all the major streets in town, both in terms of their width as well as their traffic volumes. They got up to as current a data as they could from NOACA, which is the area-wide coordinating agency for our community that collects a lot of data on traffic, as well as from the Ohio Department of Transportation. And they plotted it and color-coded it. And while I don't love the color choices, the kind of bright green, those are streets that are carrying fewer than 15,000 cars a day. And in the industry, in the traffic engineering industry, it's known that any street with that low a volume can go on a quote-unquote road diet. You can take a lane, a full lane of traffic out of service and hardly even have it noticed because, yeah, you just don't. So you can see almost our entire city has streets like that where you can pull a lane out of service tomorrow and nobody would notice, except the people on bicycles who would be happy. The yellow are in the middle category, 15 to 20,000 cars a day, and even those streets very often are put on road diets, and you substitute 2 lanes in each direction with 1 lane in each direction and a center turn lane. That's done. You'll see this in a lot of suburban applications, and those streets may well have 20,000 cars a day, and it still works. It starts to get a little dicey. Over 20,000, you have to do a lot more design to make it safe. But we hardly have any red streets showing on this map. Where we do, West Shoreway, the pinch point at I-90 where it dumps into 55th, and that's going to be alleviated when the Opportunity Corridor opens. I mean, it's basically, takeaway is the entire city is ready to be transformed.
The main red line going east?
That would be, I believe that is, I think it's Carnegie. It looks a little low for Chester. Yeah. So out of this early, ad hoc planning emerged this vision for an 80 to 100 mile network that would be designed with kind of a subway style at-a-glance logic. You could look at a map and kind of intuit your way through town. Oh, I want to take the blue line to the green line if I want to get from North Collinwood to Lakewood, that kind of thing. We looked, because we were interested in the center lane, and Jacob's going to elaborate on the whys a little later in the presentation, we looked to other cities around the country who were doing some experimenting with center lane 2-directional bikeways. Pennsylvania Avenue in DC was one of the early ones, and its, quote, protection is in the form of paint, and at intersections some little plastic bollards that stand about this tall. So that was one we looked at. There's a Green Lane project that's been advanced in how many cities now? About 12. About 12 cities across the country, and they're trying to come up with plans where the bike area is much more clearly delineated through a lot of green paint. And in this case, they show plastic bollards extending all the way between the cars and the bike lanes, and very well marked pedestrian crossing zones. We found a street in Midtown Manhattan, which is a little more European in feel. It has a pedestrian space in the center, area to sit, to walk, and it's flanked by one-directional bike lanes, but all of it's contained within a buffered, protected space. And then, as we saw a few minutes ago, the Queens Plaza cycle track, that's one of the newer installations, with really beefy buffers between the way this particular road's designed. The lanes to the right of the bike facility are the through lanes, and the roads to the left are more the local shopping parking lanes. So the higher speed lanes are to the right. So you can see how it's designed with the taller buffers protecting. If someone were to swerve, they're going to hit a wall, not a little curb. But it gets lower and more pedestrian on the other side of the facility. And this is another proposal. None of these, with the exception of Pennsylvania Avenue in DC, are really built. This is in Philadelphia. It's a proposal to connect 2 river-based bike corridors through Midtown or Center City, Philly, along Spring Garden Street. And I love this rendering because this is really what I picture this being. It's just this park-like feel where you can comfortably move around the city. Yeah. So we also took things to another step because one of our initial planning team members was an architect who volunteered. Oh, yeah,
Barb,
Dan.
no
No
problem. Do you have
problem.
any examples from more Midwestern towns or towns that have a significant amount of snow or low temperatures?
We don't, but I can speak to the snow considerations because also early on in the process, a subset of our team went up to Winnipeg, Manitoba for the Winter Bicycling Symposium, and those are some truly snowy cities. It was Minneapolis, Winnipeg, all. And, we presented on this, and they really liked the concept because we had a place to put snow, with the buffers. That's a big consideration. And they also showed us some techniques for managing the snow because in places like that, they don't plow right to the pavement because that creates icy conditions. They cut holes in their plow blades and leave a little snowpack behind. It's fascinating. But yeah, do you have?
Yeah, the examples of more Midwestern or cold weather climate ones aren't center lane, but they're still protected bike lanes. And you would think of like Penn Avenue in Pittsburgh has one. The Indianapolis Cultural Trail, which is 8 miles around downtown Indianapolis. Minneapolis is planning some, but I don't believe they've implemented any. But they have really good snow management policies for their multi-purpose trails in their city. And Columbus, Ohio, actually just built one on Summit Street and 4th Street that opened almost a year ago now. They're all curb buffered, protected bike lanes, but similar snow management practices would need to be built into it.
Did that address that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so we did some work because we had an architect on our ad hoc team. He volunteered some of his colleagues, and we did some work of the intersection of Norwood and St. Clair because we wanted to select an intersection that we knew to have a lot of turning conflicts. That's right where St. Martin de Porres High School is, so there's a lot of turn movements in the morning and afternoon. This street at this point, curb to curb, is 72 feet wide, and it's carrying 12,000 cars a day. It's madness. So with that kind of width, yes?
Yes, but at certain times of the day, the density is a killer, literally.
Well, that's part of the problem with level of service design. They design our communities that we live with 24/7 for about a grand total of 45 minutes of the day. I mean, our rush hour, quote unquote, is so condensed, and that's what we're designing for. And the point of view of a lot of bike and pedestrian advocates is that's a really bad way to design a city. Go through at whatever slow speed you have to, suburban commuters, crawl your way through. That's what's appropriate here because it's a city. It's not a highway. So that's the bias. There's lots of biases built into this presentation, but that's a strong bias, yes. Okay, so this is a cross-section that we worked up. Some of the battles that you normally have to fight when you're trying to bring in bike facilities are on-street parking. In this case, non-issue. This street is so wide, we even made the parking lane 8 feet, which is wider than you need. 7 feet is more than adequate. So we said you could keep 8-foot parking on either side. We designed the through lanes at 12 feet, which would be more than wide enough for any emergency, like a fire truck, a bus, a semi, tractor trailer. I mean, that's highway, literal highway width dimensions. And the reason also for that is if there's a car broken down, which does happen, you would even have room to pass. A person could move off a little bit closer to a parked car if there was a parked car. For the most part, there aren't parked cars along here, but yeah. So, we took all that into account. And even with that, it still left 32 feet behind that could be designed as a park with bike lanes in the middle. Now, that's not the design that came out of the city's formal study, but I mean, just as a quick and dirty look at what we have to work with, we have a lot of space to work with. This was, if we were to develop it with paint and bollards, kind of what that space could look like. This is, if it were a green lane version, that's kind of what it could look like. And this is more the direction that we hope it heads. And I'll turn things back to Jacob, who will talk about the planning, the formal midway planning study of the last year.
Yeah, so as Barb mentioned earlier on in the presentation, the City of Cleveland, as a result of this grassroots effort, took this idea after some prodding and decided to study it with some support from Barb's Center for Disease Control REACH grant to make this an actual formal City of Cleveland studied area. And it was interesting because the conversation through that study kind of went from if this is possible to where can we put it. These are some of the renderings that came out of that study. It was about a year-long process, a number of public meetings, a large survey, which I believe Barb will talk about in a moment. And this is an example of what it could look like in downtown on Lakeside Avenue, where you're literally reclaiming 2 lanes that exist now for car traffic and putting in a linear park. Kind of some arguments in favor through this process that came up on why the center of the road is better than a curbside bike lane. You know, it really eliminates the door zone crash potential. It eliminates the idea of cars actually parking in the bike lane, which is a big problem in Cleveland, especially if you look over on MLK. There's always cars parked in the bike lane on MLK. It reduces the idea of distracted driving. You're in a protected space. You don't have to worry about somebody on their cell phone or somebody eating a cheeseburger, you know, sideswiping you in the bike lane or crossing over into the bike lane to make a turn because you're in a specifically dedicated space. And it also utilizes the general rise of the road at the center to increase visibility of cyclists. So you're slightly higher than cars that would be to the right or to the left of you.
Yep.
Not to interrupt, but another thing, as a cyclist, people throw garbage out of their windows, and if you're in the center and there's that buffer, then you wouldn't be going around, say, broken glass and other hazards for cyclists.
Yeah, yeah. In addition to that hazard, there's a natural buildup of like car tire residue. Every car going by is leaving behind a little bit of its tire every time they go by. And you don't think about it, but when you're biking, there's this little fine little particle. That's just all the junk being left behind from the cars, and that wouldn't, and it gets thrown into the lane just by, you know, kind of centrifugal force sort of thing. So status. Jacob mentioned there has been a planning study that's just completed that was led by the Cleveland City Planning Department. They retained a very strong team. A woman who led the team is an avid cyclist herself with the firm Parsons Brinkerhoff, and they brought in a firm out of Detroit that managed some of the traffic engineer and what was the firm that managed?
Smith Group JJR.
Yeah, did a really intensive survey process. They had an online and in-person survey going on over the summer and early fall. I think they ended up with about 590 respondents totally. They had way more than that visit the site, but everybody who visited the survey site didn't complete the survey. But what the survey asked was, are you riding? If you're riding, where do you ride? What are you riding for? What streets would you like to see improved? They got a lot of very good data out of the survey. So yeah, we expect that within the month, the final plan will be going to the City Planning Commission for final approval. So that is the formal stamp that this is a city project, which is huge. I can't really overstate how huge this is, because it was only about 2 years ago that Jacob and I were being laughed out of rooms, like, yeah, right, this is going to happen. And it's now one of their projects. And so because we don't just want, and because we don't just want the world's best plan, but would rather see actual facilities built, we volunteered to lead the funding committee. So we have our first funding committee, I think I put that in here, coming up on the 21st of this month. And it's going to not only have people from the city of Cleveland, but also some other stakeholders like Downtown Cleveland Alliance and Cleveland Neighborhood Progress and, you know, other entities like that. We know for this system to get built out, we have to create and really exploit all the multi-sector interests that come into play for a project like this. This is not only about increased mobility, although it certainly is about that, and improved health and safety. It also has a major on-site stormwater capture potential. As some of you may be aware, our sewer district is under a US EPA consent decree where they have to slow the transmission of stormwater into their pipes during storm events because we are an old city with a combined sewer system. So when it rains, those pipes that are normally just carrying sanitary sewage also carry stormwater. And what happens? It spills into creeks, spills into our river, spills into our lake, which is our drinking water. So we have to, over the next, I can't remember how many years, but it's a relatively short time horizon, the sewer district has to eliminate the number of combined stormwater overflows. So we made a similar presentation to mid-level engineers over at the sewer district, and they loved it. They saw such potential from this project to really help them in a green way address their issue. And the beauty of that, they have dollars that they have to spend. We have a rate increase that's in place, and we're paying more on our sewage treatment every year. This way, instead of just getting clean water, not to understate the importance of that, we could also get beautification. We could also get bike enhancements. So it's a win-win-win.
Can you just explain how that happened? You're saying that that center lane then captures water then?
Well, we'll have a planted median between where the bikes are and where the car travel lanes are. And depending on the width of the street, the median can be the skinniest dimension that we've agreed makes sense is 3 feet. So that's like the lowest level. You'd have 3 feet, 3 feet, so 6 feet. Along miles. If we're talking about 100-mile, we did some quick calculations, and it was somewhere around 250 acres of land that a system like this could give the sewer district. So that got their attention. I mean, that's starting to be a sizable amount. And we had she was on the scene briefly. Her husband was going to school at CSU. She was a water engineer, and she was a part of this ad hoc team for a hot minute and did some calculations of what a midway along just the 3-mile opportunity corridor could capture, and it was striking. It was really impressive. So there's this water capture, there's the just enhanced streetscapes and placemaking. We would hope that as this is designed, we've done the rough and dirty traffic engineering. Nothing's designed truly, but just rough dimensions of what would be necessary. But we would hope that as this really begins to be designed fully, every stretch could kind of celebrate the neighborhoods through which it passes. It should be about where you are, not just about getting through where you are. It should be celebrating our neighborhoods. So there's lots of ways that we are going to explore that, including we're going back for a second shot at this grant called Art Place, which could be a way to start to address some of this. Increased economic competitiveness for these corridors that will have this lovely facility in front of them. And the last piece was a little wild and crazy idea, but I thought, I know we talk a lot about high-speed, ultra-high-speed internet access, and we have our Digital C program led by Lev Gonik. So I sat down with him to ask the question if he thought high-speed internet providers would pay to have access to this right-of-way, if we could sell them access so they can put their cables in. And he was so excited, he said they would pay you to run empty pipe until they're ready to run their cable. It's that competitive. And he didn't think a target number of $2 million a year was crazy. Because we need to find some revenue streams for this. I mean, that's the downside of a street. It doesn't produce a lot of revenue unless you put a toll road in, and that's not going to happen. So we need to find some either rock-solid partners like a sewer district that could say, out of this pot of money, which we can show a funder is an actual, real, we have revenue experience, we'll dedicate this much. We need to get similar streams like from the ultra-high-speed internet providers, from the city's increased income tax. I mean, this is going to take a lot of doing. We want to ensure alignment with any residuals of our Affordable Care Act that remain. And also, Jacob touched on it, some of the surveys that were cited about what African American and Hispanic riders are looking for, came from a survey done for the bike industry because they are nervous. They recognize that their growth area has always been white men, and that's plateaued and has started to come down. And they recognize and have learned through their surveys that women and minority riders want different kinds of facilities. We're not the spandex crowd that want to prove how tough we are. We want to make sure our grandkids not run over. I mean, so it's a very different mindset. And the industry has heard that, and I think they're another place to look for some dollars to bring this vision to fruition. So going into, I'm not going to go through this, but going into the meeting, coming up with the city, I've done some analysis of, both short-term, the city committed, and this is a short-term proof of concept pilot network. The city's committed to two things. They have 3 short segments, one along Lakeside Avenue from West 3rd to East 9th, one along Community College from East 22nd to East 35th, and a segment along Superior from the west end of Public Square to the east end of the Detroit Superior Bridge. They committed to doing those as pilot proof of concept corridors. We, as a group that was advising the city, said, this is a network proposal. It's not about unconnected, discrete pieces. That doesn't tell the story. We have to find a way to fund a mini network. So we suggested from the east side of Public Square on Superior out to 55th, north on 55th, and out St. Clair to Martin Luther King. That starts to tell the story. And the city said, yes, we agree. So we have taken it upon ourselves to fund it. So if the consultants' numbers are right, it would be all those combined would be about only a $4.5 million project. I don't think those numbers are right. I think those numbers are understating because our in-house ad hoc team member, who's a traffic engineer, had higher numbers 5 years ago. So the right hand is, okay, if they're wrong by half, what would it be? So somewhere between 4.5 and 9 million is what we need. And still, this is chump change. It's chump change. So one pot of money, and we were at a presentation last week by the Ohio Department of Transportation. They have safety funds, and they have a pot now where without any selling, you could get $250,000 for implementation. I talked with the woman afterwards who manages that pot of money, and when I used the word pilot, she said, oh, well, if you're talking about a pilot, we could do better than that. So we have a conversation next week to see what better looks like. Better won't be $1 million, because I did finally get on and look at their budget, and that would be too much of their budget. But maybe it's $600,000, maybe it's $500,000. NOACA has been very, and I've used this acronym a couple of times too. Do you know, most of you in the room know, Northeast Ohio Area-Wide Coordinating Agency is the entity through which transportation dollars flow, some water quality dollars, some air quality dollars. They have a director who is a Clevelander, had worked for RTA for years, went to Chicago, learned about biking in Chicago, and now she's in charge of NOACA. She has been supportive of this project from the get-go. She was really like, what can I do to help? So we expect we can get some dollars, real dollars out of them. We're looking to the city's income tax increase because something that I know, because I used to work for the city running their capital improvement program, is 12.5% of every income tax dollar raised is supposed to go to capital improvements. Now, someone needs to remind the city of that because that is the law. The voters passed it. It was higher than that at one point, and then at the time, Mayor Voinovich reduced it to 12.5% because it was hitting the operating budget too hard. But it's not been changed for 20 years, so we're going to remind them. Into the city of Cleveland, yes, yes, yeah. It's the restricted income tax pot.
I just want to point out too, I mean, I think part of it is just and especially for the city, just a realignment of priorities. I mean, when they want a project to happen, they find money. I think of the dirt bike park, randomly found $2.3 million to build a dirt bike park. They have a new fund as part of bond dollars that were listed last year of $25 million for neighborhood investments. I mean, there's a potential pot of money for things like this. So where the city's priorities lie is where a lot of the funding goes. So I think a lot of it lies on me as an advocacy group to push the city to do that, but also folks like you that really love this idea of really connecting neighborhoods via linear parks to serve bike and pedestrian safety enhancements, but also enhancing economic development to make it known that these types of things are really where we want our tax dollars to be spent, or the priority.
Yeah.
Could you describe again where you think, you said the network goes from where to where?
Picture any big fat street in the city. That's a potential. I regret we had a map. Yeah, we had a map that we should have had in here.
There were 15 corridors identified as part of the study, but the corridors we're looking at to fund with initially as part of the $9 million would go from the Detroit Superior Bridge on Superior out to East 55th, and then East 55th north all the way to the lake, and then St. Clair continuing east to MLK would be the proof of concept segments.
Yeah.
So you would connect basically from Detroit Shoreway, just being here, all the way to the university.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
all those things in between, which
Yeah.
is really what
Yeah.
you want to say.
Yeah, Chester is one of the streets that was on because it already has a median,
Yes.
and often it's concrete and not very attractive. So Chester is one of the corridors that made the cut in the first 15. I mean, the maps that I'm regretting we didn't include here, and I'm kicking myself right now. There was one map that showed connectivity all over the city, which is really exciting. And then the city skinnied it down to the top 15, and then you're in this land of disconnectivity, and it's like, that's not the vision. But it's at least movement in the right direction, so I'm not going to fight it. Yeah.
So how supportive are the CDCs?
Very.
Okay.
Yeah, we presented initially to the Organizers and Allies group, who have more contact with actual neighborhood residents than the CDC directors. And they were really into this and thought it was a great idea. And then we presented to the executive directors groups. They have monthly meetings convened by Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, and they too were very into it. So quite honestly, we've not made a presentation yet where anyone said, oh, what's not to love? I mean, we have a bunch of extra pavement and people getting killed by cars. Yeah, so why don't we do this? Yeah.
So can you give me a proportion of, so I'm thinking of, if they were putting in an RTA, something transit that way, you've got not only the building of it, but you'd have the maintenance of it. What's the proportion of maintenance to something like this?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. In a lot of instances, we'll be pulling out of the city's maintenance responsibilities a third of the roadway, and we intend and will find a way to fund a private maintenance operation. When we look to the whole system, that gets into larger dollars. That's about a $200 million vision, and the reason that's a $200 million vision is we want about a $30 million maintenance endowment. So potentially a foundation could commit dollars to the Midway, not have to write a check and just say it's to Midway maintenance and we'll give you the endowment earnings for maintenance. We expect a private workforce, maybe managed by Bike Cleveland. That's my vision, but we haven't adopted this as a concept at Bike Cleveland yet, so sorry, Jacob. But some entity managing a workforce that maintains these facilities, because the city won't do it. If you ride the Euclid Corridor bike lanes, you know darn well the city won't do it. They clean the streets and put the junk in the bike lane. And so that's not our vision.
And the idea of that follows the Indianapolis Cultural Trail. They set up this endowment,
Did they
set
do
up
their
at the Southeast Indianapolis Community Foundation, where they set up an endowment. So they have maintenance crews, and they also manage their bike share program that goes out and keeps it clean, keeps it plowed, does the planting every year, cuts the native grasses in the fall.
Okay.
So it's kind of the idea of what we're trying to build it off
The
of.
bike association.
Yeah.
Yeah, something that there's a network and it's easy to manage. So there's a group that does it as opposed to just building it and hoping that city crews will.
Yeah, I'll get to your question. I just want to tag on one thing here. They also told us early on that they couldn't have done the fundraising, private fundraising, without being able to tell the potential funders that we're going to do the maintenance. We're not relying. They had the same issue with their city that we have with ours.
So in terms of looking at other places, I'm assuming you've looked at high-density cities in Europe, even in Hong Kong, would be a good place.
I'll volunteer for that assignment. I haven't, yeah. But we do have some folks who were involved with the project and who are Bike Cleveland board members who have traveled and knew of some. Where was John McGovern? Barcelona. Barcelona was a city that just decided almost overnight, we're going to change our city. And they implemented like 30 miles or something in a couple of year period and have a really robust network. And that's something that we had a committee member pretty up to speed on.
I think much of the ideas nationally around protected bike lanes came from, cities like Amsterdam and Copenhagen. Mm-hmm. So those Green Lane Project cities Barb mentioned, the national nonprofit that was taking those city leaders to those places, we're actually visiting them and doing learning exchanges to say, look, this is how we did it, and you can do it too. You just need to have the political will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dan.
Have there been analyses about these sorts of bike lanes or these sorts of initiatives as drivers of economic development?
Yeah.
I'm curious how that.
Do you want to talk to?
In the corporate community, like adopt a section, and or if you're, I would imagine there are more pedestrians, and that's maybe drives business into.
Yeah, and Barb and I talk a lot about bikes because that's what we love. But yes, this is really good for pedestrians too. I mean, Barb mentioned briefly about kind of the holding zone for older people that can't get across the 72-foot wide street as fast. They now have a resting zone when this is installed. But yeah, nationally there has been a lot of economic studies around the kind of the benefits of bike infrastructure as a whole, and more recently around protected bike lanes. And they found that streets, and you look at the Euclid corridor. I mean, prior to the Euclid corridor coming in, a lot of vacant properties, and now there's millions and millions of dollars in investment. This is very similar to that. Indianapolis Cultural Trail. It was last year we took, 2 years ago we took Chief Silliman, the mayor's chief of staff, and Councilman Simperman there, met with their mayor, and it was $8 billion worth of investment since the trail had opened. So there's certainly.
How much could they attribute to the trail?
Well, it was about a $60 million project investment. When they told us the $8 billion, they were associating it all. Like since the trail has opened, there's been $8 billion of investment. Yeah. And we saw it when we were even there. I mean, there was there's holes in the ground where they were currently building new buildings, a lot of apartment complex, a lot of new small businesses along the trail.
New York City studies.
Yeah, I mentioned nationally there's been a lot of studies. New York, talked about people on bikes tend to spend more money in a neighborhood place than somebody in a car. And if you think of like St. Clair Avenue, you're driving through St. Clair, you're not necessarily going to stop at the Upcycle Parts Shop because you're going from point A to point B. But if you're on a bike, you're more likely to stop. That's what studies have found.
Yeah, and there have been some really good studies done by the New York City Transportation Department where they very much tracked economic activity on a protected bike corridor versus a similar corridor that didn't have that kind of improvement. So there are actual economic analysis done by the city of New York that are really solid. I can't remember the names of the streets, but yeah, they exist.
There's also, and this even happened locally, cyclists want to ride in safe places. So as a corridor becomes transformed and has a bike lane or protected bike lane, people will actually shift their commuter routes to use that corridor. So they're actually drawing more people there. And this happened on the Lorraine-Carnegie Bridge. NOACA does, twice a year bike counts. They found on the Detroit Superior Bridge, once the Lorraine-Carnegie Bridge was complete with the separated space, counts on Detroit Superior Bridge went down and counts on Lorraine-Carnegie Bridge actually went up. So people were actually willing to go out of their way to find a safer route.
I promise I'll step after this one. It's related. Have you talked with UH or Cleveland Clinic? I mean, there's like UH bikes. I'm curious if they'd be interested in also sponsoring Path and/or Cleveland Clinic gets sponsored. It's like.
Yeah, well, that reference to the Affordable Care Act residual, that very much there in my mind. When I say that, we had invited a couple of folks from the clinic today in hopes they'd be here, but we'll be talking with them. We definitely want to do a presentation to them to introduce the concept. And UH Bikes work real closely with Jacob. We had a question over here first.
Would there have to be additional places to secure those bikes? I mean, would that interfere with the pedestrian traffic?
Well, that's another beauty of this center lane space. You could have some bike parking, you could have some bike share located within the corridor depending on the width of the street. Like on St. Clair, you have nothing but real estate. So you could, in the center, you could just cross one lane, be in this protected facility, get your bike rental and go. So it could actually ease congestion on the sidewalk rather than go the other way. So, but that would be part of the planning and placemaking for every single neighborhood where this would be installed, to ensure that you have that balance, because you don't want the bike facility to be impeding pedestrian movement. Yeah. I had Sue?
I have a question. I kind of want to come back to the idea of the impact on equity, and was curious about other cities that have done similar kinds of installments, if anybody had looked at an increase in ridership across a broader spectrum of potential riders.
Yeah, I know around bike share, there's been a lot of attention in a couple of cities in particular, most recently Philadelphia, thank you, where they cited their bike share facilities in such a way to ensure neighborhoods that were underserved, lower income neighborhoods, had access. But that didn't, and they also have a cash payment option, right? Yeah, because that's a big obstacle that a lot of these bike share systems have. They assume everybody has a credit card. That's something Jacob is working on with UH Bikes to try to enable the system that we have currently to take cash payments, and also a special credit card through a credit union that they're talking with that would be issued to people who don't have credit cards. But, you know, in broad terms, just the population of our city, if we put in facilities that are broad-reaching, we're going to be hitting every population in town. And we do know from bike counts and from activities like bike distributions, there are a lot of people out there riding currently who aren't included in formal counts because they may be working a second or third shift and they're riding at night without lights, and we have been meeting and talking with people like that and asking them what they would think. We do a little survey on the spot that Case helped us develop. So we're trying to get input. We tried to do some neighborhood presentations on this over the summer, and I have to admit we must have done a deplorable job marketing because we didn't have a very good turnout, for those workshops. But we're going to continue with it. Yeah.
But again, if the facilities are more prevalent, I would think that is sort of going back to the question, like what happened with the Indianapolis, what happened first. I don't think you could probably dissect. It all happens simultaneously.
Yeah.
Right? So the more facilities you have, the more interest people see it and are more likely to come out to a gathering. Like it just...
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to go for that natural experiments.
Yeah,
there is a funding opportunity, natural experiments on making an environment less diabetic. They've invented a new term to describe a city with a high
diabetes.
Yeah, diabesogenic. Yeah, but in any case, this project is at the perfect place to do a research study. The plan's done, nothing's built. So Elaine and her team suggested some other possible sources for research dollars, and we're also looking at a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant, because we want to capture this moment and see what the impact really is on who rides, where they ride, all that. Yeah.
One thing that strikes me with this is the difference between this and the opportunity corridor. It is again like this idea that you have two parts. You want to be able to get people from A to B. Like I think using a connectivity from downtown to University Circle, like having that as B is a good one, because people do want to be able to commute.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's all of the steps in between that I think like the car method of this doesn't work, because people don't really want to be able to, they really are just going A to B. Mm-hmm. With a bike system, it is about getting on your bike and being able to go 4 blocks and go to the store and send your kid. Like,
mm-hmm.
How much are you playing that part up? Because that seems to be a very big missing piece. You would send your kid on foot half the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's not just in the city, that's in the suburbs as well. It's like having a protected space that you knew your kids could get on their bike and go 4 blocks to the whatever.
Yeah.
How much is that?
Well, and I think part of it is, the Midway is just one typology for a bike facility, and there's other, there's just general bike lanes, there's buffered bike lanes, there's curbside protected bike lanes that might not, streets that might not necessarily have enough space to do a center lane one, but you can make a connection to a center lane one from another street that might have another type of facility that would facilitate those more neighborhood-centric focused connections, you know, getting from your house to your school. You know, you might not necessarily need to use, you know, St. Clair Avenue, but you need to go to St. Clair and you need to go down 67th and you need to go over, you know, it's really about thinking of it in a holistic way on what the full network looks like. But I think our excitement is that, you know, this is a big step towards, one, building a network that would create a safe space and get more people out to help push for those other connections as well. And we do have a lot of connections as they exist now. I think of streets like East 22nd Street would make a great connection to some of the larger segments that we're talking about initially. You know, the Harrison Dillard Bikeway makes a connection north and south to where the terminus would be. So I think it's about, you know, thinking about it as a whole network. Does that answer your question?
Where are we on time? I don't have my glasses on.
We've got about 7. We usually wrap up at quarter after.
Okay, yeah, all right. Well, that was pretty much what we had to say. I mean, basically, closing thought. Streets stand at the nexus between planning and public health and offer us lots of opportunities for this population-level intervention. And the actual closing, we had to do like family pictures. This is me last summer, my first big ride, 62 miles for 62 years. You know, you start small, you get going, and then Jacob, yes. We're building for Milo, yes. So, yes. So, any additional questions? Yeah.
I know that in a lot of European cities like Copenhagen and Amsterdam, in addition to the infrastructure, one of the things that allows for biking is driver awareness. Yeah. For someone like myself who would fall in the interested but concerned category, and I'm sure for many others, what are things that we can do while we're waiting on the infrastructure that would improve either driver awareness or our own personal safety?
Yeah, that's a great point, and we have been talking about that at Bike Cleveland's Advocacy Committee. And some of these things are very simple things that could be taught in driver's ed and tested on as part of a driver's test. For example, simple little way that people open their car doors when parking in some European, you're trained to open your car door with your right hand, or depending on your car. Sometimes the cars, they're driving on the opposite side, but you're reaching across your body because it forces you to move your eyes so you see a bicyclist coming by and most likely wouldn't choose to open your door in front of them. Now with your left hand, you're not looking at all, you're just opening your door blindly. So those kinds of things wouldn't cost anything. And so we have had some conversations.
Yeah, we've also done the past couple of years with support from the Center for Disease Control REACH grant a public awareness campaign called We're All Drivers. It's really hits more on the emotional side of things, so it uses kind of local people like Sandy Alamar's part of it, Tracy Lind, who used to be at Trinity Cathedral. We have a couple of CMSD students that are part of it, kind of doing posing with their bikes. And the message is really around, like, you don't know who's going to be on that bike in front of you. It could be your superhero. It could be your deacon at your church. It could be some kids just trying to get to school. So give them the space that they need. So that's something we're going to continue to do. We're launching it again this year. We're also working with ODOT and some statewide groups to rewrite the Ohio Driver's Manual, the bike sections of it. If you ever read it, I haven't read it. Actually, I don't think I ever read Ohio's because I was trained in Michigan, but there were some pieces in there that weren't necessarily law, but they were like suggestions, but they were also law pieces. So a lot of us who were reviewing it got confused about, like, what is the goal of this document? So we're actually going to be more defining what the laws are and updating the laws, because there's been a lot of really good bike laws that pass. So example, like we now have a 3-foot passing law statewide. And outlining specifically what are the laws for motorists when it comes to cyclists, and what should cyclists be doing as well, or what do cyclists need to do as well, and then creating separate documents around suggestions that cyclists should do. One example was, it said in this driver's manual that to dress brightly in very bright clothes, and that's not a state law, but it's probably recommended. So kind of helping to define those things and getting them to the right audiences, kind of where we are on the public awareness side of stuff.
Yeah, there's going to be an educational sting going along with the implementation of the statewide 3-foot passing law. So police are being issued a little sonar device that will measure where 3 feet are. So police on bicycles will be equipped with this, and they're going to be issuing educational tickets. It's not a fine yet, but to just get the message out that things have changed. And to that point, over the last, everything since we had the REACH grant, Jacob's been doing police training, primarily targeting City of Cleveland police, but also Metro Parks police, because there's a lot of issues in Metro Parks in terms of understanding that fast-moving bicyclists do not belong on their side paths. They're far too congested to safely mix in that environment, and also some suburban police districts as well. We had another question back here.
Well, just a comment. That forces vigilance on the driver, okay? A better solution, I think, would be to talk to the automaking industry about warning devices that alert the driver so the vigilance doesn't have to be hyper vigilance. It can merely be general vigilance.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about that. My husband just bought a car now. It has those side things where the lights light up if you get close. I was wondering if it actually would capture a bicycle that was going by.
Yeah.
It'd be a good question to know, because if that technology is coming and is going to be eventually part of most cars.
Yeah, I do agree. I mean, technology is huge, but there's also the responsibility you have when you get behind a 2-ton vehicle in an urban environment, especially. You know you're going to be running into pedestrians, you're going to be running into people on bikes, there's going to be dogs or cats. I mean, there's things you need to be aware of. One of the things that frustrates me the most is when this happened when that horrible crash down in Brecksville happened, and a lot of the comments turned to, well, what could the cyclists have been doing differently? Well, to be honest, they weren't doing anything illegal or wrong. They had lights, they were wearing bright clothes, they were riding where they're legally supposed to be. It was the motorist. So I think a lot of it is this mindset shift of, really we're all in this together. I mean, despite what your political view is nowadays, we're all still human beings, and we all need to just freaking get along. And that exists on the roadway, too. I give the example a lot is, I'm teaching my kid now to share, Go to school, share stuff, share when your nephews or your cousins come over. There's some point along the line where we learned in our heads, like, sharing the road is a bad thing. This is my space. But in reality, it's not. So really, there's that cultural shift. And I personally don't see anything wrong with, educating police officers on the laws so that they can enforce them. Because when you get behind a vehicle, it's your responsibility to know those laws. And if you're going to get a warning, I mean, we try to push them, give them tickets. This is a law in Cleveland. It's been a law for 3 years. 0 tickets issued ever. Yes, cyclists have been hit. So I think part of it is just informing people,
We had another question over here, I realize. Do you still have a question?
Curious about the 3-foot rule, as long as we're reading up. They just put bike lanes on Madison and Lakewood, near where I live, and it doesn't seem possible for me to get over 3 feet, because the bike lanes are right on top of these fairly skinny lanes. Like, are bike lanes excluded from that? How am I supposed to comply with that?
No, it's always 3 feet, and actually the state law also says that if you're passing a slow-moving vehicle, which would be a bicycle, you're allowed to cross over the yellow line to pass it. So that would be your maneuver. You'd wait till traffic is clear and you pass when it's clear over the double yellow line. It's no different than, and we had this conversation in Bay Village when they passed their 3-foot passing law. It's no different than when you're passing the garbage truck or you're passing the mail person. It's somebody on a bicycle.
Okay. Anything?
We're about at time now.
Okay.